We're going to talk today about working and disabilities, mental illness among them. And we have quite a good panel, I think, to discuss these issues from all sorts of angles. To my left, your right, we have Ashley Counts, who's a global messenger for the Special Olympics. Ashley has a unique perspective on working with a disability while also suffering from a mental illness, and she will share that with us. To her left is Bob Drake, another Bob. Please don't be confused. He is the smart one. He is the Thompson Professor of Psychiatry and Professor of Community and Family Medicine at Dartmouth and Director of the Dartmouth Psychiatric Research Center. To his left is a familiar face in the disability community, Andy Imperato. Andy and I have known each other for longer than either of us cares to admit. Run across in various Washington circles. Among other things, he has run, I think, every major disabilities organization in Washington. He's currently called Executive Director of the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, which does not fit on a business card, I'll bet. And finally, I have Mike Thompson with us. Mike is a principal for many years at PricewaterhouseCoopers and is going to discuss with us a program that he has done with NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, in New York on stigma in the workplace. So we'll begin with Andy, who's going to give us an overview of this subject and talk about a very critical piece of how do people get into the workforce. How do they adjust to working on a day-to-day basis? And in fact, what kind of services should exist, don't exist? What are the challenges that people face? And in particular, Andy's going to talk about stigma as a challenge, I believe. Now that I've put words into his mouth, we'll hear from Andy directly. Let me just say one more thing, and that is if any of you have something to say, something strikes you as particularly egregiously stupid or interesting, please stand up when you hear it. Don't wait for the question period to begin. We really want this to be interactive and to hear from you because we're, while an interesting bunch, certainly have no monopoly on knowledge about this subject. So take it away, Andy.
Well, thank you, Bob, and we're all going to be brief too, so we'll get into a lot of interaction with the audience. But I think what I wanted to share first, just on a personal level, I'm also a person with bipolar disorder, and having a career has been my most important mood stabilizer. If I didn't have a job to go to every day and didn't feel like I had a purpose, I would dwell a lot more on my depression when I was depressed. And my high energy would probably get directed in less healthy directions than I'm able to direct it in my work. So I think this is the topic for the disability community writ large, but it's especially important for people with mental disabilities. Our numbers as a community as a whole, based on the Bureau of Labor Statistics, show us that more than 2/3 of people with disabilities are not participating in the labor force. These are working age adults not participating in the labor force, meaning not working and not actively looking for a job. And that 2/3 number really hasn't changed much since the passage of the ADA 23 years ago. So then you look at people with significant mental health disabilities, people with intellectual disabilities, and the numbers participating in the labor force are even lower. So I think it's important for us as we talk about the 50th anniversary of the Community Mental Health Law, which was also the Developmental Disabilities Act, which created the authorization for the University Centers for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, which is the group that I represent, among others. We've made progress in the last 50 years, but in this area of employment, the progress has been very, very modest. And I think there are definitely people like, a lot of the folks that are connected to this panel who have had success in the labor market. So it's not like that's not happening. But the vast majority of people with bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, other high incidence conditions of obsessive compulsive disorder, the vast majority of us who are having success in the workforce still don't feel comfortable being out at work. And, we can talk about why that is, but I know Christine Griffin, who's here, is a former commissioner at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. One thing that Chris says, which I completely agree with, is that if we want to change attitudes towards people with disabilities, the best way to do that is to have them in the workforce and have people working alongside of them see what they can do. So when you apply that to people with non-apparent disabilities, if they're not out at work, you miss that opportunity to change attitudes. So, I think that's a big opportunity. The other thing I want to mention, Senator Harkin, my boss immediately before coming to work for AUCD, felt like we were at a tipping point on this issue of disability employment. And I think that's a useful metaphor as we think about this topic in terms of the next 50 years. What can we do in the next 2 to 3 years to leverage a bunch of things happening at once? We have a generation of young people who've grown up since the ADA in integrated environments, people with and without disabilities, who have higher expectations about what's possible for people with disabilities in the labor force. We've got a new rule under Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which requires federal contractors to be more aggressive in finding people with disabilities, and it has a goal that 7% of their workforce at all levels of the workforce should be people with disabilities. So I think one of the challenges for our panel is how do we make sure that people with mental disabilities, including people with significant mental disabilities, are part of that 7%? And that's when you get into supports like supported employment, making sure people have transportation, housing, the infrastructure that they need to have success in the labor market. And the other big opportunity I see is a global one, and Bob, you just came off of a job where you were looking at issues across the globe. The rest of the world, for the first time, many of them are looking seriously at disability because of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. 139 countries are a party to that convention, and they want to learn what is working in the United States so they can replicate it. So it's an opportunity for us to really project what we know is working for the rest of the world and have an impact around the world. So I'll stop there.
Let me ask you a question, Andy. If I was going to ask you, or I will ask you, what's the single biggest obstacle to someone who has a mental disability, a mental health illness, from getting a job? What's the single biggest thing that stands in the way?
They don't believe in themselves. I think the way that somebody has success in the labor force is by learning to believe in yourself and to be willing to take the risk to do the job. And I think we have a lot of inputs around us where when you get the diagnosis, your family's expectations for you go down, your best friend's expectations for you go down, and part of your job as a person with a disability is to raise those expectations back up and surround yourself with people who have high expectations for you. But I really do believe that if everybody with a mental disability believed that they could have success in the workforce, believed that they were valuable and could add value to any team, we would have more success in the labor force.
We'll get back to that later in our discussion. Let me turn to Ashley and ask you, Ashley, just to give us a personal perspective on being a member of the workforce, the kinds of challenges you've faced, the kinds of people who've been helpful to you, and what kind of advice you would have for people who are seeking work and then working and dealing with disabilities at the same time.
Thank you, Bob. Well, just like many people on the panel, I also have a mental illness and also have a intellectual disability, which mine is not, you can't tell that I have one, but being in the job force just makes it hard because people find out that you have a disability, they just turn their back on you, or they interview for a job and then they find out you have a disability and just put their decision in that and not the fact that you have the qualifications for the job. I've had several jobs where people treated me with disrespect. They yelled at me for absolutely nothing. And I spent a lot of my time on my own, which was very hard, especially for somebody that has depression, because I went to work every day and I did the job, but I felt very, very alone, and I didn't have anybody to turn to. And then, by a miracle, I found the greatest job I've had since after I graduated, and I'm now working at Booz Allen Hamilton in Northern Virginia, and it's the best job I've had. People treat me with respect. My boss has invited me to go to lunch. He's watched me rappel down a 25-story building. He even watched me. I left out that part.
I don't know if that's a good advertisement for Booz Allen or not.
The point is that they gave me the courage to go to work every day and face. They just see me as a human being and not as somebody with a disability, and I enjoy every day. And when I got furloughed, which stunk, luckily I had my little dog to keep me company, because like the gentleman on my left, and just like Bob said, if you don't have a job that you love, then you just don't feel like going in. You feel like, what's the point of going in? And with Booz Allen, I feel that I'm doing the best job I can, and they praise me for doing a good job, and if I make a mistake, they show me how to correct it, and I could never be more happier. So.
Do you think this is because the people that you work with have had experience in their families or with other folks who have disabilities, or do you think that the company itself has created that atmosphere?
I think the company itself has created that atmosphere because they are big supporters of Special Olympics. I only know one other Special Olympian, but I'm sure there's a lot more throughout the whole corporation. My fellow athlete, David Egan, is a big part of Booz Allen as well as Special Olympics. So.
Okay. Let me turn now to Bob Drake from Dartmouth, which is reason enough to talk about mental illness being stuck up there in the woods. Sorry, it's a little Dartmouth thing of Dartmouth. Give us the big picture here. Take us from the micro to the macro. Tell us what are the challenges that you see, and give us the kind of big numbers that you're dealing with when you look at the employment question for people with illness, disability.
Sure. So we study moose mental health in New Hampshire, but we're affiliated with lots of states where there are more people, and we do many studies of employment and mental health service programs. And the big picture is that people who have mental illness or mental health disabilities or in the disability system want to work and want to be productive citizens just like everyone else. If, the surveys show that 75% of people want to have a competitive job, and if you look at young people before they've been sucked into the disability system, it's probably more like 95 to 100% of people want to go to college, want to have a job, want to keep up with their peers. The good news is that we have effective services. We really know how to help people get into competitive employment nowadays. There are 20 randomized controlled trials of supported employment for people with serious mental illness around the world, 10 in the U.S. and 10 in other countries all around the world. Every one of them shows the same thing. We can help at least 65, 70% of people get into competitive jobs and be successful.
And Bob, can you just explain what supported employment is in case people aren't familiar?
Oh, sure. Supported employment is just a common sense, direct way of helping people to find a job and to be successful in the job. So we meet with the person, we ask them what they're interested in doing, we try to help them find a job that's consistent with their interests as directly and as rapidly as possible. We don't put them through pre-employment training because all the evidence shows that's completely ineffective. We help them find the job that they want as quickly as possible, and then we help them on the job to learn how to do it and to be successful. And all the long-term studies show that we can not only get people into work, but they like the jobs, they stay in the jobs for years. It improves not just their income, but also their self-esteem and their ability to manage their illnesses, just like Andy talked about in his personal experience. The jobs last for a long time. The most amazing thing to me is that health costs go down dramatically once people are working. So I would think that would be an important factor for our government and people who are thinking about these programs. But the negative side of this story is that if you look at SAMHSA data or Medicaid data, it turns out that less than 2% of people with serious mental illness get any vocational services at all, and probably less than 1% get effective supported employment services. So that's a huge, huge challenge for us. This is the number one goal that most people with mental illness have, and we're far, far from being able to serve them well.
Let me turn finally in our opening segment here to Mike. Mike is focused most recently on the problem of stigma and stigma in the workplace. And he's involved with a program that I'd like him to talk about, a program which is called I Will Listen. So Mike, give us a little picture of that.
I'd like to set it up just a little bit.
Please.
With kind of how I see the workforce, because it's not just, the issues associated with stigma aren't just limited to hiring and how we treat people at work. It goes well beyond that. And I in my world, I actually deal with benefits, healthcare benefits, and things like that. And when we look at what's happening with benefits, there's a lot of programs. To your point, there's a lot of programs to support people. We have mental health parity, we have EAP, very good programs really to support people who are ill and need support. But stigma is actually the issue of the day. And the reason stigma is the issue of the day is a few different issues. Certainly it's the employment issue, but it's also the ability for people to self-identify that they have issues. Not just come out, but actually self-identify. They don't consider it an acceptable thing. It's an issue for people recovering with mental illness, even silently recovering when they can't engage in a real way. It's kind of we're living in a don't ask, don't tell world, right? Where nobody wants to talk about this stuff, and it goes beyond that, on and on and on. Why do people who have children who suddenly have major crises in their families, why do they go it alone? Why don't they engage with friends? And we did studies, NAMI did studies that showed that only, I'll quote loosely, 60% of people will actually tell somebody in their family about mental illness. And then like 40% will tell a friend. Tell a friend. What kind of friends are those, right? And only about 10 or 15, it's some number like that, will actually tell a coworker. Stigma is so prevalent for mental illness, it outweighs every other stigma out there. Race, sexuality, all those issues, by a lot. And so it's just a pervasive issue, and it has huge ramifications for the people involved. It also has huge ramifications for businesses themselves, and we can talk about that later. But let me talk about I Will Listen, because I Will Listen is a campaign that's been launched in New York City by NAMI New York City, and Barbara Ricci's over there in the red, and she's the president of NAMI New York City, and she's the one that has helped to launch and initiate this in New York City. And it's not just an employment-based initiative. It's something that is being launched with kind of an internet-based, social network type thing. We're looking at colleges, but the other big leverage point is employment, and that's the one I'm focused on, employment. And what we're and the focus of I Will Listen is not about getting people with disability to come out. Frankly, it's not very safe out there to come out. It's not even clear that that will help people, progress and do better. It's really about the rest of us. It's about engaging people without disability and people with disability to be open to listening to people with mental illness. There's been a series of videos and all that help to generate those activities. They've used this video in the employment setting. Barbara's own firm had an I Will Listen Day, and they essentially engaged employees, educated them on some of the stigma issues around mental illness. They had them do videos about I Will Listen. What was amazing is that it broke the silence. Suddenly, that organization had intranet blogs going on and on about mental disability and this and that, people coming out, some who were brave, some who had family issues, and people were engaging in a real way about, yeah, I'm not comfortable with this and this and that and this and that. It started in New York City, and it went global. It went global. It's really, really amazing that little things can actually happen to break stigma. And in my mind, it's about breaking the silence. The silence is not the solution. The silence is the problem. That's what we're trying to get at. I Will Listen is about getting the rest of us to open up and say, if you have an issue, feel free. You can come talk to me. It can be in your family. It can be you individually. I'm open. Right. And one at a time.
All right. Let me turn and ask the audience a question. If a friend of yours came to you and said, look, I have a mental illness, and I'm having trouble at work, would you say to that person, tell your boss and tell your coworkers? How many people would tell a good friend of theirs who was having a mental health problem to go to their boss and their coworkers and be open about it? Hands?
I think it would depend on what the problem was.
All right, let's say the person was having a serious episode of depression and was having trouble at work. I only saw 2 hands when I asked that question, which is really depressing. Okay, so a few more are being raised.
I want to raise it to tell you why I wouldn't.
Please.
I would not. I'm an attorney. I run the disability law center here in Massachusetts. It's a protection advocacy agency. Was at a legal services intake fair just the other day, and someone came in, sat down, very accomplished woman, worked for a big health insurance company, they know better. And once she went out on short-term disability for the first time in her life to deal with depression, and everyone knew about it. She was open about it. She talked about what, deaths in her family and all the things that exacerbated her situation and made her go out on short-term. When she came back, she said everything was different. And they literally drummed her out of there and terminated her. And everything she described was to a T what I've heard over and over and over for years, and this is what happens. And so if someone's coming to me for legal advice or as a friend, I'm going to try and help them figure out how to deal with the workplace situation without actually saying, this is what's going on with me. And there are sometimes you can't. Sometimes you actually have to invoke the words and ask for the reasonable accommodations and other things to stay in the workplace. But I advise people all the time that if you don't need an accommodation and you don't need to expose that part of your life to the workplace, don't do it, because it's very dangerous, and it's stigma, and it's society's view of people with hidden and psychiatric disability in particular.
So Bob, can I respond?
Please respond, and I'd ask you to step to the microphone if you wouldn't mind.
And I don't personally feel that there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that question, because there's so many nuances. And I know, Chris, you don't disagree with what I'm about to say, but So let's assume everything you said is 100% accurate. The question for me as a matter of public policy and social change is how do we change that? And one way to change it is to challenge it openly. It's high risk. It works better for people. Right. It works better for people that have a lot of status and a lot of human capital and can find another role. But to me, being out at work with any type of non-apparent disability is part of where we're headed. And I do think there's a generational piece here, too. I think the ADA generation, as Senator Harkin refers to them, are much more comfortable being out with their disabilities. And I think it's a good thing. So I just wanted to give that nuance.
I agree, and I think we do have to evolve, but right now, the reality is, especially right now, the whole issues on, mental health and violence and everything in the workplace, the stigma has actually increased. It's worse in the last year or two. So.
And you use the word evolve, which is a very important word because it means something that works very slowly over time. Let me go to the, if you want to stand up and make a comment, that'd be great. But let me go to the person at the microphone, the woman at the microphone first.
Okay, thank you. I'm Barbara Ritchie. I'm board president of NAMI New York City. And the study that Mike and I commissioned showed that only 13% of people are willing to come out to their colleagues in the workplace. And so for the record, we're not at this stage at NAMI New York City Metro where we're encouraging people to come out in the workplace and tell their boss. Maybe one day we'll be able to be there. But we do want everyone in the workplace to say that it's okay if you need to get help. And we want to address the absenteeism issues and we want to address the presenteeism issues. I work at Deutsche Bank. We have 35,000 employees. We're a global investment bank based on Wall Street in the Americas. And we did an I Will Listen Day, and we had the head of the investment bank make a video down to the security guard make videos, making a pledge to listen. And we had Aetna at the table with us, who's our provider for healthcare insurance, and we had our benefits people at the table. And the point was, from their perspective, that they wanted the employees to know that they had all these employee assistance programs, which have abysmal usage rates, and that truly are private and confidential. I can't speak for everybody's firm, but I went with the head of benefits, and I studied how they got information of who used the programs. It was absolutely confidential. And the usage for mental health was a couple percent. And yet it's the number one reason for absenteeism and disability in the country. So that's why Mike and I are so focused on mental health in the workplace. And we have a roundtable that meets every couple months. Other companies represented there are American Express, Credit Suisse, Boney Mellon,
Right.
PricewaterhouseCoopers.
Let me put something forward then. You talk about government programs. You talk about service and people not being able to get service from these government programs because they're underfunded. What's to say that the next step in making this happen, that we're not better to spend our time on the private sector as opposed to trying to push around a government, state government, or a federal government that doesn't seem to have enough money to begin with to support these programs?
I want to make one more comment to that because I agree. I think the time is very ripe to engage the private sector. The corporations are very big on wellness programs. They've all done their physical wellness. These benefits people are desperate to do something new. They need a new, something with pizzazz. They are ready for mental health programs. We've had lawyers come to the workplace mental health initiatives that we do, and they all agreed that there are definitely liability issues for the companies around, if you do layoffs in a year, but a year ago someone, there's a lot of issues around that, but they've also agreed that there's so much low-hanging fruit that they can ignore those liability issues for now and try to offer benefits programs and bring awareness into the workplace. So we're engaging these companies, and they are responding, and they're coming back for more and more, and they're not complaining about the costs. They want to deal with their employees on substance issues and on mental health issues. So I think the time is very ripe, and Mike and I can talk to people about that more offline if you'd like.
What's your reaction to the notion of the private sector being the kind of the edge of the spear, the leading part of the spear, the point.
Yeah. From the research perspective and trying to spread services around the country, Johnson & Johnson has been the biggest contributor that we've had, much more than any federal programs. And they have been wonderful, sincerely believing in this, getting the NAMI organizations involved, getting voc rehab and mental health to work together to create programs. I think it's an era in which we've got to engage the private sector.
But Bob, let me just chime in. I think no question that we have to engage, and there's value in engaging the private sector. And a lot of these forums, we don't hear enough from the private sector, so I appreciate that perspective. Mm-hmm. But let's be clear that for people with significant disabilities, many of them are involved with the government whether they want to be or not, and the government does create barriers to their ability to work, save money, and have a life in the middle class. So if we engage the private sector, which we're certainly doing with Section 503 and federal contractors, that's 20% of the workforce.
See, there you go again with your section this and section that.
Affirmative action for federal contractors, 20% of the workforce, that's private sector. But again, if we want that to work for people with intellectual disabilities and people with schizophrenia and other significant long-term mental health disabilities, we have to see, how's that going to work for somebody who's trying to get off SSI and get into that job, and are we really making it easy for them to do that? And I think we have a lot of work to do in the public sector as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to cite, this I Will Listen is a very new program. It just started, and we've already got glimmers of hope maybe in there, right? But I want to give due to DuPont, who is probably, in my mind, the leading company in this space. And DuPont invested its own money in its own program called ICU. And it essentially created a video that doesn't have words to it. It has characters to it, and then there's an overlay with words that really talks about people embracing people that aren't themselves, that are kind of withdrawing somehow, that are kind of not clearly there might be something going on there, and then helping them to access resources that can help them. So it demonstrates that the normal way things happen is, of course, somebody gets reserved and then everybody shuns them. And they get more reserved, and it goes downhill real fast, right? And what they try to do is they actually show pictorially people getting closer to that person, putting their arms around them, helping them. They've actually rolled this out and shown it to 100,000 employees globally. They've translated it into 20 languages. It's incredible. And they've put it in the public domain so other corporations can use it. So my point here is this is not like a figment of our imagination. This is something that is starting to happen today. And I think the government needs to set the standards and the rules, but we have to win minds and hearts. Minds and hearts start with leadership, and leadership can start in the corporate office.
Okay. Let me turn to you, Ashley, just for a second, because something I thought I'd never say. I have some warm, toasty feelings about Booz Allen. Having
So
heard I'm sorry if anybody's employed by them for the first time. Do they have a corporate program that educates people about people with disabilities that you know of?
I am not positive 100% about that, but they, in a lot of ways, they are big supporters of Special Olympics. I mean, they have a basketball game. One is McLean and one is Oakton, and these kids are, have physical disabilities, and they just go there and cheer them on, and it's a great thing for these guys, because for probably the first time in their lives they feel that somebody's excited for them, and they feel good because people are cheering for them,
right,
instead of criticizing or putting them down.
Okay. Let me turn to the gentleman who's been patiently waiting. Sorry.
My name is Robin Cunningham. I'm co-founder of a new advocacy organization.
Would you speak into the mic a little more?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
My name is Robin Cunningham. I'm co-founder of a new advocacy organization called Cure Alliance for Mental Illness. I'm also a retired corporate executive, investment banking, commercial banking, international shipping. I've been everything from chairman down to chief bottle crusher. In any event, I am anxious, having a business background, to get more, my organization get more involved in the workplace. And I've been having a fair amount of difficulty trying to figure out how to do that. I've got some ideas. I need to discuss them with somebody in detail, which isn't appropriate for this occasion. So my question is, are any of you free for lunch?
Yes.
Okay.
Anybody else? I'll take you all.
We've solved your lunch
And
problem.
I'll buy.
Okay.
I'll do this again.
Can I?
Yes, you wanted to have make a comment, Bob. I'm sorry.
You know, we reach out to employers all the time to create positions through supported employment, and we get over 5,000 people with mental illness a year into competitive jobs. I talk with employers all the time. The most consistent feedback I get is, well, the people you send us are just like everybody else, except that they're more loyal. They really appreciate having the job, so they're a good influence within our workplace. So I'm sure there's stigma on the one hand, but there are all these positive things too that are going on, having people with mental health disabilities in the workforce.
I will say, having just spent 7 years in the private sector at a rather large company that prides itself on being progressive, not all companies that pride themselves on being progressive are as progressive as they ought be in this area. The one thing that I think does help prove this point to companies is if you can show them a study that says they'll save a lot of money by instituting these kinds of programs. To me, at least my experience shows that over time. Ma'am.
Yes, Lucinda Jewell from the Depression Bipolar Support Alliance, and I had the opportunity to have a conversation and correspondence with Bob about evidence-based practices after a wonderful Harvard Psychiatric Conference several years ago.
Did you use the words wonderful and
a Harvard Psychiatric
Harvard?
Conference? Yes, I know. Oh, my God. It's not just eggheads getting together. There's really cool stuff
I must
going
be in Boston.
only in Boston and only in Cambridge. And I, as an advocate and as a person who lives well with bipolar, one of the things that I think we can do just right off the bat and so simply to combat stigma and neutralize its effects is change our language around it. And I hear you keep talking about mental illness, disabilities. The more we focus on mental illness, the more mental illness we have. And the proof of that is we have more mental illness, quote unquote, now than ever before. I do not have mental illness. Sometimes I'm ill. I have a mental health condition that is in the medical model called bipolar disorder. Some of it is a disorder, but most of it is an in-order. It makes me, makes me very creative, et cetera. We can talk about that another time. So basically my request is to get really conscientious about the language you use. Only talk about illness when you're talking about someone who's experiencing symptoms that to themselves and the people around them occur as debilitating. And I think, what the work you're all doing is great. And I know you live with the bipolar and you're out about it, and obviously a contribution. And I think that's where we need to start concentrating our conversation about mental health is the contribution we make and how we, as I said earlier in the main session, how we increase the GDP, how we contribute to our family and friends, how we contribute to the workplace. And to be thrown asunder when we're out for 2 weeks because we're dealing with our major depression and then to be fired is not the way to treat people. And we lose that talent as a result of thinking it's disposable. So language, thank you.
So
Fair
let me just say, and I think language is a very personal issue, and I wouldn't tell people how to describe themselves. But from my perspective, it's been very empowering for me to use the word disability to describe myself. I'm a disability rights lawyer. I'm a second-generation disability activist. Disability is a part of my identity, and it's not a negative. I have a lot of disability pride. So I get that the rest of the world doesn't. And I get that word to most people sounds like a negative that you don't want to dwell on when you're interviewing for a job, for example. But for me, it's a source of human diversity that gives me insights into what I do, and it's a positive. So I appreciate what you're saying. I don't like the word illness at all. But the word disability, to me, doesn't have that negative connotation just because of the cultural context that I've been raised in.
Well, if you talk about the abilities that it gives you as a counterpoint, that's
Sure.
great. And the neurodifference conversation is neurodiversity coming out of the autistic world is another thing we should be incorporating into our conversation.
And let me just make one point. First of all, guilty, and I agree with you. So then secondly, I would say in my world, which is more health benefits and that type of thing, I think another word that plays right is chronic condition. We are so focused on people with chronic conditions and how to keep them well, right? Some of these are chronic conditions. It's no different. It's diabetes. It's the same thing. And these people under control are very productive parts of the workforce, and they're costly if they're not. So it's the same thing. If we can go down that same path, there's already appreciation that we need to treat people with chronic conditions special.
Sir, I'm sorry, I've got a call on.
Hi, my name's Paul Kuziak. I'm not in the healthcare field, just a parent with 2 sons in recovery. And
Could you pull the mic up just a bit?
oh, sure. Hi, my name's
Thanks.
Paul Kuziak. I live in Massachusetts. I have 2 sons in recovery. When I raised my hand earlier, I didn't want to suggest that I would have encouraged a fellow employee to go to personnel or to bring their situation to the company. I would have absolutely tried to help them in a heartbeat if given that chance. I would have welcomed that, connected them up with various resources like NAMI and others. But I wanted to just share 2 quick stories, one from a parent perspective when I interviewed with a company. And by the way, my volunteer work, I'm a parent advocate with the Massachusetts Organization for Addiction Recovery and also at the national level with the partnership at drugfree.org. When I interviewed at a startup, I've worked in high tech for about 30 years, and about 7 years ago, the last company that I worked for, I did about everything wrong that you could possibly do in an interview. I said, I am absolutely not going to live in the nose cone of an airplane. I'm not going to be a hamster on a treadmill working, 100 hours a week. I want to have balance in my life. I have sons in recovery, and on and on and on. Oh, by the way, my volunteer work's important to me, and oh, by the way, when you give me my territory, it needs to include Minnesota because my kid's out there in treatment, and I plan on traveling there on your dime. And I ended up getting the job. So that was one story, and the cool thing about it later on is I ended up meeting a lot of really, a couple of really neat parents, in that company who felt comfortable coming to me and disclosing that their kids, were struggling. So I was able to, help connect them up with services and help them navigate the system. When my youngest son, who went into treatment at 16 and a half for his addiction to opiates, he's now 25, and he has probably about 6 to 7 years now of sobriety, so I'm really proud of him. And when he put together a resume, because he wanted to get into the plumbing field, his work background wasn't wasn't the greatest. Worked in fast food restaurants and hardware stores and things like that for short periods of time. So we talked about his strengths, and in the end I said, wouldn't it be great to just focus on those? And who cares what people know about your background? Often they're going to find out anyway, and wouldn't it be better to just not be looking over your shoulder? So instead of just saying he worked in fast food, he talked about the fact that he worked for a family-owned business, and that he drug tested some of the other employees, and that he was responsible for taking the receipts to the bank and depositing them. And those are just a couple of examples. He put on there that he attended Sobriety High in Edina, Minnesota. I think that probably could raise a flag that maybe he's in recovery, and that he also graduated from a recovery school here in Massachusetts. He put together his own resume, he made calls, he mailed it out, and within a week or two, he had a number of calls from people. And it didn't take him long at all, to get a job. And that first job that he accepted as a plumber apprentice, he's still there now about 15 months, about a year later, and he's doing really well. So it's a tough call going public. I wouldn't suggest early on doing that with employers because sometimes they talk a good game, but they don't follow through, and they can discriminate. The stigma is very powerful, for sure. But there are other companies who do a good job at trying to help. But I think, again, I would refer a friend to an organization like NAMI or other local organizations. Thank you.
Reactions to that story?
I think I would just reinforce it. I don't think we're in the camp, as Barbara said, we're not in the camp of people kind of coming out to their employer if it's not visible. I think it's easier when you have a position of stature, your position, right? A position of stature, because you're pretty secure in your job and you're performing, and it's obvious you're performing. And so the fact that you disclose has risk, but it doesn't have as much risk. When you're starting out, gosh, and a lot of this is kids, right, coming out, it's just another thing you got to be worried about. And frankly, it's the people with stature, people who don't necessarily have to be at the top, but they're kind of like the people on your boards. They're people with stature that have experienced mental illness in their life. Those are the people that can become the advocates. Those are the people who can sell into those organizations to change because they're secure and they can make it happen. So, again, that's the way I see it.
Sir?
Hi, yes. I'm Jonathan Delman, and I'm a person who's had very serious mental problems throughout my life, starting when I was a little kid and probably until I was about 35, and I couldn't find a job. I was suicidal. But for the past 15 years, I haven't had serious mental health problems. So I don't think I have a chronic condition, even though I take medications. I've married and work. I think I'm pretty successful. I know Bob is a researcher. So I guess we can look at this. And I wasn't going to talk about language, but I just think about I'm a person who I continue to work on myself. I realize I have tendencies, and I use a little internal cognitive work that I do on myself. But I think that everybody needs to work on themselves. I mean, anybody who works with and for people who have issues. So I think I've reached a point where I'm one of those people. Except I'm more conscious about my issues, having been through hell, through intensive psychotherapy. So I just wanted to comment on. My research area is employment, with a large focus on young adults, and we have a research and training center funded by SAMHSA and NIDA at UMass Medical, where we hire young adults to work there as research. For 12 years, I've been training people identified with mental health conditions as researchers. It's not rocket science. It's not everything statistics. I think we make jobs too. A lot of people can learn, not every person, to conduct an interview, to do data entry, and be part of the research team and contribute to the research question. So that's the kind of work I do, and for the most part, it's been pretty successful. It's not like every person you hire works out, but you need to be very sensitive to each individual's needs. A lot of people don't have that work experience, and I've done a little bit of writing on this. But my broader question, having worked with young adults, is the bigger picture around careers. And we've started to think about that, which potentially involves some additional education, supported education. And the other way I'm looking at that is through peer services, peer specialist services. So I'm now studying.
If you can get to the question, that would be great.
Yeah, how do we deal with careers? How do we help people get careers?
Okay, so how do we get people started, I guess, is the question.
Well, supported employment programs more and more incorporate supported education, and we found lots and lots of young people want to go to school at the same time or before getting into a job. But we've also found with the people who are older that many want to go back to school in order to get a better job after they establish their confidence that they can be a steady worker. So, I think the whole field is focused on let's help people to not just be employed. We know we can do that now. Let's help people to move to, be as successful as they can be.
I guess I would just add, I think there is a conversation going on in the disability field broadly about that we don't just want jobs, we want careers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the way that the career gets defined needs to suit the individual interests of the individual. And I think in our society, sometimes we have a very narrow definition of what a successful career looks like, and it's a little bit of a mythology when you compare it to what's actually happening in the workforce. So I think part of that is about learning resilience, learning how to bounce back when things happen that don't work out. And part of it, again, is learning what are the jobs that energize you rather than sucking the energy out of you. And if you have more energy when you go home than you have when you went to work, you're in the right job. And whether somebody else thinks that's a good career for you or not, to me, that's the most important indicator. If you're energized by what you're doing, you're in the right job.
Mark Perriello, I'm the president at the American Association of People with Disabilities. Before I get into my question, which will be quick, I want to acknowledge my predecessor, Andy Imperato, who's very large.
I told you Andy had it everywhere.
Yes, and my board member, Chris Griffin, who is down in front there. Here's my question, right? So one of the challenges I think that we have, right, is we aren't necessarily seen as a community. We aren't a community, right? When you go in, you do your assessment, right? You find out you have schizophrenia or bipolar, right? No one's giving you a pride sticker, right? And saying, let's go out to the bars, right? We don't have a march on Washington and a Martin Luther King. We don't have a Harvey Milk saying, right, run for office and, right, I'm here to recruit you. My question is, how do we build that? Do you think it's necessary, right, so to sort of do that in order to instill the confidence that people can come out in the workplace and disclose their mental health condition? And if you don't think that, what are the things that exist now, and how do we get that information into, right, the hands of people so that, right, the very, very disconnected people?
Wow. I'll take that impossible question.
Go for it.
And this is based on 30 seconds of interpretation of what you just said. No, I guess it was 10 seconds. But I think of other stigmas of how it's kind of resolved. It hasn't resolved. All these stigmas exist. They get better. They don't get, they don't resolve. And oftentimes the gay lesbian need those people of stature to step out in front and be part of it. But I would also then say that when those communities really take hold, it's when people who aren't the affected group, that aren't the people, join. We talk, when we talked about this particular campaign, we talk about the situation with Kobe Bryant, and we say it isn't until the people outside of the affected class of stature say it's not okay. It's not okay to talk about a teammate as a fag. It's not okay, right? I think it's a combination, right? We're going to need leaders that are in the community, absolutely. But most importantly, we're going to need the rest of us to say it's not okay. I will listen. That's what it's about.
And I guess I would just add, Mark, as somebody who spent a lot of time in the LGBT world, I think you see the connection, and I see the connection. I mean, I think being out at work as a member of the LGBT community generally is a good thing for your career now. Might not have been good in the 80s, better now. So my question is, how do we get there? How do we get from the 80s? We had a Harvey Milk, we had other things, and we got there. Some of it was political. But the not comfortable at all. But by the end of the summer, they know the history of the disability movement. They see what a proud disabled person looks like, proud disabled person with a non-apparent disability or an apparent one. They're comfortable advocating for each other. and they feel like they're part of a community. So if that was going on all over the country as people are coming of age as students, that's one way to change the national
all Democratic, which is why I've been treated well. Sorry. This is Massachusetts, I can say that. I still wonder why no national candidate in this country has tried to befriend the disability community in a really serious way and get the families of people with disabilities, all sorts of disabilities, involved. There are millions and millions of people out there, we call them voters in politics, who could give a real boost to some candidate at some point. I think that might get Mark towards his goal at some point. It's going to take someone with good advisors and a lot of brains to kind of figure out, oh, wow, there are these people out there, maybe I could win their support by doing the right thing. Just a thought. One last question.
Bob
Sorry, Bob.
Oh, just to add to this, one of the things we've been doing recently that I hope will expand and be effective is to hire lots of young people with mental health problems to be devising new ways to use social media. They're a whole different generation in terms of how they use social media and how they think about all of these concepts and how comfortable they are being open about the issues that they have, and they're really a fantastic resource. And I think they have a chance of changing the world.
Yeah. Well, coming from Google, where we do some work in that area, not as successful as others, but some, there's no question that sharing about those issues can be a big positive. I worry as a parent of teenagers about people who share too much. That's another subject, however. We have time for one more question before we're going to have to shut this down. Please.
I have one thing. I was thinking, I don't know how people feel with disabilities. One way to get around non-disabilities is if it's not an important disability at the time, especially like if you're depressed and you still have a job, try to change the job a little bit and keep going with the job is more depressing to go home to an empty house and just do the work.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a good place actually to wrap up. I'm going to give everybody a chance to make a comment here at the end. But that notion of the centrality of work to health for anybody with a disability is something that I think we can all appreciate. And so many of people in this room are working towards. But let me ask for final comments here, beginning with Ashley.
Sorry, that wasn't it.
It is. Ron?
The National Health Service in Britain has put into law that they define employment as a health outcome, as the most important health outcome. I think we're far away from that in this country, but it's something we should aspire to. People who have disabilities of all kinds want to have a job and want to have a positive identity, and we should do everything we can to make that a reality.
I guess I'll close by saying we've focused a lot on this panel and at this forum on mental health disabilities, not as much on intellectual disabilities. So in my closing comment, I just want to say, don't think that this employment issue is not critically important for people with intellectual disabilities, because it is. If you think about self-esteem and you think about how to become part of the middle class and become a full participating member of your community, very hard to have all of that without a job. And I think in this country, we still don't really expect people with intellectual disabilities to work. And we're not good at listening to people with intellectual disabilities about what they hope to do, want to do, and encouraging them to take risks and to pursue their dreams. So I think that's a problem on the mental health side too. And what's exciting to me about this forum, and I hope the closing panel, I know Madeline Will is here, I hope Madeline does this on the closing panel, but bring it all together. We're going to get there faster if all these smart people that are thinking about mental health and all the smart people who are thinking about intellectual disabilities and all the self-advocates and broader disability community are working together and saying employment is central, and any presidential candidate needs to say what is their agenda to bring more people into the labor force.
So I'm going to say I think there's a tendency to look at business as the enemy. And that's part of the problem. Business isn't the enemy. It's going to be very hard to get business to embrace mental health per se. But businesses have a moral compass. If you understand the moral fiber of the business and you step into that conversation and affiliate this, and yeah, we're going to need advocates that march to the mountain, right? But you can engage business, and business will react. And I think we're at the culmination of this is the beginning. It's not the end. This is the beginning. And every one of these movements had a beginning. This is something we're going to be talking about for the next decade, and it's going to sweep, my opinion.
Well, from your mouth, let us hope all sorts of people are listening to that. I wanted to say thank you to the panel. I thought they did a terrific job.